I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
There were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range.
Catherine can access my personal fortune, not Camilla. 7 words, written by Prince Philip, sealed for years. And now, they've just blown up Buckingham Palace. What if I told you that one letter, hidden in the royal archives, has the power to destroy a queen consort's entire legacy? To erase her from history? To hand everything to the one woman Camilla never saw coming? Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the man who stood silently beside Queen Elizabeth for 70 years, left behind a letter that wasn't just about inheritance. It was a weapon, a time bomb, a final act of war. And here's what the palace doesn't want you to know. Queen Elizabeth read this letter before Philip died. She cried. She approved it. And she never told anyone. Right now, at this exact moment, there are senior royals who wish this document had been burned, who've tried to suppress it, who are terrified of what happens when the public learns the truth. Because what Philip wrote wasn't just, Catherine gets the money. It was, Camilla threatens everything we've built. She must be stopped. Why? What did Philip see happening behind those palace walls? What did Camilla do or represent that terrified him so much he had to leave instructions from beyond the grave? Before we expose every shocking detail, the secret meetings, the legal clauses that ban Camilla's family forever, the alliance protecting Catherine, and Prince George's cryptic message that went viral, you need to subscribe right now. Hit that button, turn on notifications, because the royal family's PR machine is working overtime to bury this story. And YouTube's algorithm might hide this video before you see how it ends. The discovery. Picture this: a routine archival review, dusty documents, expected procedures, and then silence. The kind of silence that precedes thunder. The letter was buried beneath decades of estate papers, marked only with Prince Philip's distinctive personal seal and a chilling handwritten instruction: to be opened upon my passing, in presence of the keeper and one blood heir. Think about that for a moment. Philip knew this letter would be opened after his death. He knew it would cause chaos. And he sealed it anyway. Why? What could possibly be so important, so explosive, that the Duke would set a time bomb ticking inside the palace itself? Here's where it gets shocking. Very few people within the inner court even knew this letter existed. Not Charles, not William, perhaps not even the Queen herself. At least, that's what we were led to believe. When that seal was finally broken, according to multiple sources present in the room, time seemed to stop. Senior officials, legal advisors, the keeper of the Privy Seal, all frozen in collective disbelief. Because what Prince Philip declared wasn't subtle, it wasn't diplomatic, it was crystal clear and brutally direct. His personal fortune, accumulated quietly and completely independent of crown accounts, was to be entrusted to Catherine, Princess of Wales. And explicitly, deliberately, not to Camilla, Queen Consort. Let that sink in. The Duke didn't just choose Catherine. He actively excluded Camilla. In writing, with legal witnesses. This wasn't a preference. This was a declaration of war. Those present during the reading described the atmosphere as suffocating. One aide later confessed anonymously, "It felt like Philip had reached from beyond the grave and grabbed the monarchy by the throat." The wording left absolutely no room for interpretation. Philip wrote of Catherine's unshakable devotion to duty, contrasting it sharply. And we need to understand how devastating this is, with what he called conflicted motivations threatening the clarity of the crown. Who do you think he was referring to? Who represents those conflicted motivations? The implications hit like a freight train. At Clarence's house, where Charles and Camilla had assumed an unspoken permanence of influence, panic erupted. Advisors scrambled to verify the document's authenticity. Could it be a forgery? A tabloid fabrication? Wishful thinking from anti-Camilla factions? But every test, every verification, every legal examination came back with the same answer: authentic, undeniable, final. It was Philip's unmistakable handwriting, sharp, deliberate, absolute. Now here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Behind closed doors, senior courtiers, the ones whose job is to protect the monarchy's image at all costs, debated whether the letter could simply be suppressed. Can you imagine? A royal's dying wish, buried to protect political convenience? There were whispered efforts to quietly file it away, to minimize its relevance, to pretend it never existed. But those efforts were blocked by a rare internal override from the keeper of the Privy Seal, who insisted that Philip's final directive be honored and officially logged. One official later described it perfectly. The letter was a political earthquake in royal disguise. But wait, because what comes next will absolutely break your heart. New evidence suggests that Queen Elizabeth herself knew about the letter. According to leaked diary entries from one of her former ladies-in-waiting, the late Queen had been shown the sealed document weeks before Philip's death. She read it. She understood what it meant. And she wept. But she said nothing. She told no one. She kept her husband's final act of defiance buried in silence. Was it respect for Philip's wishes? Was it fear of tearing the family apart? Or did she know that revealing it while she lived would destroy the very institution she'd spent 7 decades protecting? We may never know, but the weight of that secret, carried to her grave, tells us everything about how dangerous this letter truly was. The fracture. Philip witnessed. To understand why Prince Philip would take such a dramatic, personal, and politically explosive stand, we need to rewind. We need to go back to his final years and see what he saw behind those palace walls. Because behind the public smiles, the carefully choreographed appearances, the ceremonial bows, Prince Philip witnessed something that terrified him: a monarchy at war with itself. During those last years of his life, Philip watched the rise of 2 completely contrasting visions for the crown's future. One rooted in duty, restraint, and tradition, the other in disruption, reform, and personal agenda. And what unsettled him most wasn't the scandals or the tabloid headlines. It was what he saw in private: the deepening divide between 2 rising camps that threatened to split the monarchy down the middle. On one side, William and Catherine, embodying restraint, responsibility, and quiet service. The next generation, learning to carry the weight without complaint.
It is a year since we launched the Royal Foundation Centre for Early Childhood, and the reason for the centre's launch was twofold. It was to not only help improve the early childhood outcomes, but it's also about prevention.
On the other, Charles and Camilla, projecting reform, modernization, but stirring deep unease among traditionalists and the public alike.
Freely, please let us not become too politically correct.
Philip, ever the strategist who'd spent decades studying how monarchies survive and how they fall, recognized the existential danger of this dual monarchy in waiting. In confidential sessions with senior aides, he voiced fears that weren't about change itself, but about confusion, about 2 futures pulling in opposite directions, threatening the crown's singular identity. Think about what that means. A monarchy can survive scandal. It can survive controversy. But can it survive not knowing what it stands for? According to multiple palace insiders who've now come forward, Philip grew especially alarmed by Camilla's increasing influence over both public optics and private decision-making. Now let's be clear. Philip was no stranger to wielding influence behind the throne. He'd played that role himself for over 70 years. He understood power, but what disturbed him, what kept him awake at night, according to one footman, was how Camilla's influence seemed to shift priorities away from the institution and toward persona, away from we and toward I. His concern wasn't personal. It was institutional. A monarchy built on mystique and unity, he believed, could not survive blurred allegiances and diluted purpose. In one documented conversation with a senior courtier, a conversation that was never meant to become public, Philip reportedly issued this warning: "If you allow parallel lines of power, the crown loses its center." Let me ask you, looking at the royal family today, do you think his fears were justified? At the same time, Philip's respect for Catherine had become quietly profound. He saw in her something rare, something essential, the unflinching discipline he once demanded of younger royals.
Earlier this year, we asked you 5 big questions about raising our under-5s. We wanted to hear what you think about the importance of the earliest years of our children's lives.
The ability to endure scrutiny without scandal, to project stability without spectacle, to stand still when everyone else was spinning. And to Philip, that stillness wasn't weakness, it was strength. While others indulged in image battles and PR wars, Catherine simply stood there, unwavering, unshakable, present. According to a footman who served during Philip's final year at Windsor, the Duke once referred to Catherine as the monarchy's spine, even if no one's noticed yet. High praise from a man who rarely gave any. But Philip's concerns went far beyond personal preferences or family dynamics. During late-night calls to Windsor in his final months, he raised alarms about succession vulnerabilities that could destabilize everything. With Charles approaching the throne, a king who'd waited longer than any heir in British history, Philip feared that unresolved public skepticism over Camilla's role could create a constitutional crisis. What if public trust continued to erode? What if internal factions turned into open disloyalty? What if the careful balance that kept the monarchy stable for 1,000 years simply collapsed? For a man who'd watched monarchies fall across Europe in the last century, these weren't idle questions. They were warnings written in historical blood. And so Philip did what military strategists do. He planned for every contingency, including the one where he'd no longer be there to hold the line. That's what this letter was. Not revenge, not favoritism, strategic intervention, Catherine's summons. When Princess Catherine was summoned to a private meeting at Windsor, she expected another routine briefing. Protocol, patronages, the usual responsibilities. What she received instead was an envelope that would change her life forever. The seal had already been broken. The letter was laid out before her on centuries-old mahogany, surrounded by portraits of monarchs who'd faced their own moments of reckoning. And as the words were read aloud, Philip's words in his unmistakable voice, sources say Catherine went completely still, not shocked, not overwhelmed, simply still. Because this wasn't just about money. This was about power, loyalty, and betrayal, all wrapped into one impossible inheritance. Prince Philip had named her, not the queen consort, not one of his own children, as steward of his personal fortune. A fortune curated through trusts, investments, and foreign accounts entirely separate from the sovereign estate, tens of millions of pounds, accumulated quietly over decades, and now hers to control. But it wasn't the wealth that shook Catherine to her core. It was the weight of trust. It was the realization that the man who'd spent his entire life avoiding public displays of favoritism had just declared one, with her name underlined in history's ink. Later, alone in her Kensington study, Catherine reportedly reread the letter 3 times. Her inner circle, trained to read her silences, described her as stricken but not uncertain. Because the implications were absolutely clear. To act on Philip's wishes would be to defy Camilla, and perhaps Charles himself. To ignore the directive would be to betray the man who, in his final written act, chose her to carry his legacy forward. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was a summons. Prince William's reaction, according to multiple palace aides, was far more fraught. He found himself trapped between impossible loyalties. A father who'd only just claimed the throne he'd waited his entire life for, and a wife suddenly thrust into a high-stakes proxy war she never asked to fight. The Prince of Wales reportedly grew tense, uncharacteristically short-tempered. He was heard pacing through Windsor's East Gallery late at night, muttering, he knew exactly what this would do. Because Philip did know. Of course he knew. The Duke of Edinburgh didn't do anything by accident. This was calculated, precise, designed to force a choice that couldn't be avoided or delayed. In a family that measures loyalty in whispers and glances, this letter was a thunderclap that wouldn't stop echoing. Catherine, realizing she needed guidance from someone who understood both Philip's mind and the monarchy's survival instincts, turned to the one person she could trust without hesitation. Princess Anne. Rumors swirled that a discreet meeting took place between the two women in the private gardens at Sandringham. No aides, no staff, just two women facing an impossible situation. Anne, known for her unwavering loyalty to both her father and the institution, allegedly gave Catherine advice that would prove pivotal. Do what he asked, but do it in your way. That guidance may have been the stabilizing force Catherine needed, because what followed was a masterclass in royal power plays. Catherine did not issue any public statement. She did not engage the press. She didn't explain, defend, or justify. But what she did do sent a signal clearer than any press release ever could. She cut all direct communication with Camilla. Not a word, not a message, not even a glance during public events. For a family so dependent on silent diplomacy, on reading between every carefully constructed line, this was a rebuke louder than scandal. It was a declaration that couldn't be misunderstood. And as the days passed, courtiers began to notice something else. Something subtle but unmistakable. Catherine's influence was quietly expanding. Briefings were rerouted through her office. Patronage updates came directly through her private secretary. Invitations to certain high-level engagements were addressed to her first, then to others. The balance of power wasn't shifting with loud declarations or public confrontations. It was slipping subtly, deliberately, and unmistakably in her direction. The question everyone in the palace was now asking: how far was Catherine willing to go? And more importantly, how far would Camilla go to stop her? Camilla's retaliation. Queen Consort. Camilla was never meant to be sidelined. And when Philip's letter was read aloud during a confidential Privy Council review, her fury was immediate and volcanic. Those in the room, seasoned courtiers who'd witnessed decades of royal drama, described her reaction as explosive. One aide whispered that objects were heard being thrown in Clarence's house shortly after. Because this wasn't just about money or estates. This was about legitimacy, about identity, about being acknowledged not just as Charles's wife, but as a rightful matriarch of the monarchy. And Philip's letter had struck at the very core of that claim. Within hours, Camilla summoned King Charles for a private confrontation. What began as a tense discussion reportedly escalated into veiled ultimatums that left even Charles shaken. Palace insiders claimed she threatened to withdraw from public duties entirely to effectively strike, unless the matter was contained and contextualized before the press could weaponize it against her. Can you imagine the pressure? The newly crowned king, trying to stabilize his reign, suddenly facing a choice between his wife's dignity and his father's dying wish. This was the nightmare scenario Philip may have anticipated. And perhaps, in some dark way, intended. Camilla didn't just react emotionally, she mobilized. Almost immediately, Clarence House operatives began working behind the scenes to downplay the letter's legal relevance. Carefully crafted statements were drafted, suggesting the document reflected personal sentiments, not legal directives. Select briefings were leaked to friendly journalists, hinting that Prince Philip had written many private notes in his final months. This one might have been just another unfiled musing. But the damage was done. The letter wasn't hearsay. It had been signed, witnessed, and logged into the royal archives. It was as official as any royal document could be. When that effort stalled, Camilla turned inward, reinforcing her position among the palace's most powerful allies, most notably the Protocol Clarion, a long-standing advisory circle specializing in constitutional precedents. The group convened for a private strategy session at Highgrove, where Camilla allegedly demanded a complete audit of all shared royal patronages where Catherine held influence. The goal was clear: recalibrate power, retrench influence, reassert control. Soon after, subtle but deliberate changes began emerging throughout the royal apparatus. Two charities long linked to Prince Philip were suddenly redirected under Camilla's purview. An educational initiative once fronted by Catherine was paused for structural review. Then came the most audacious maneuver yet. Camilla began laying groundwork to fast-track her son, Tom Parker Bowles, into a formal palace role under the guise of public outreach and modernization. It was a direct signal. This legacy would not bypass her family without a fight. But even that wasn't the end. Reports surfaced that the keeper of the archives, the very figure who'd authorized the release of Philip's letter, was being quietly pressured. According to one source, a high-level phone call from Camilla's office raised concerns about security breaches and internal loyalty, language many interpreted as an unmistakable warning. The keeper, a longtime loyalist of both the late Queen and Prince Philip, refused to comply. But the message had been sent: cross Camilla at your peril. Yet even as the Queen consort circled her wagons and prepared for total war, another faction within the palace began to quietly gather. Around the very woman Philip had chosen. The Inner Four. Not everyone within Buckingham Palace supported Camilla's retaliation. In hushed meetings conducted with the secrecy of intelligence operations, a powerful new alliance began to form. Insiders dubbed them the Inner Four. Their mission was crystal clear: protect Catherine, honor Philip's final directive, and ensure the monarchy's survival does not rest in Camilla's hands. Who were they? Princess Anne, Philip's steadfast daughter, who'd always understood the weight of royal responsibility better than anyone. Duchess Sophie, whose quiet diplomacy had earned her trust across all factions, making her the perfect bridge builder. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's own private secretary who, despite his position, had never hidden his unease with Camilla's expanding influence. And Lord Fellows, a legal mind so entwined with royal protocols that some called him the living archive. Together, these four formed a silent bulwark against what they saw as a dangerous deviation from the monarchy's true course. Their first meeting was held under the radar at Sandringham, reportedly arranged through Anne's personal network. Security was so tight that even household staff were kept in the dark about who was meeting and why. It was there that the legacy directive was dissected: Philip's letter, its legal standing, its implications, and its deeper message. According to a leak from a household staffer who found discarded notes, the tone was urgent, the mood defiant. One phrase recorded in those notes captured everything. "This is not rebellion. This is preservation." Let that sink in. These weren't rogue actors. They were the monarchy's immune system, activating to fight off what they saw as an infection. Lord Fellows was first to raise crucial concerns about the estate structure. If Philip's private wealth was to transition to Catherine, there needed to be an airtight legal framework that couldn't be challenged or dismantled. Sir Clive confirmed something shocking. Prior to his passing, Philip had begun deliberately reshaping certain holdings, investments, and offshore trusts, making them completely distinct from Crown assets. This wasn't just emotional, it was methodical. Philip had been planning this for years. Then came a chilling revelation buried deep within the estate documentation. A secondary codicil, rarely mentioned and even more rarely understood. It referenced the appointment of an unshakable moral steward, a phrase never used in any previous royal directive. The Inner Four interpreted this as coded endorsement of Catherine, not just for the inheritance, but for something far larger, a symbolic passing of the torch, a safeguard for the Crown's moral continuity. Do you see what Philip was really doing? He wasn't just leaving money, he was choosing the monarchy's conscience. Speculation within the group intensified when Princess Anne allegedly revealed something that reframed everything. She had personally delivered Philip's original letter to Catherine. This quiet admission, if true, meant Anne had known all along. It meant the plan was older, deeper, and more calculated than anyone imagined. It also meant Anne's role wasn't passive. She was the courier of her father's final will, and in many ways, its executor. Meanwhile, another force within the palace, the so-called Clarion Ring, composed of Camilla-aligned loyalists and long-serving traditionalists, had begun tracking the Inner Four's meetings. Tensions simmered. The palace felt increasingly like a chessboard, with each side maneuvering quietly but deliberately. Camilla's team moved to intercept communications. The Inner Four became even more discreet, using intermediaries, handwritten notes, and in some cases, proxy advisors to shield their strategy. But the letter wasn't the only document Philip left behind. And what emerged next would cast an even darker shadow over Charles's reign. The Sunset Provision. For decades, whispers surrounded a rumored clause buried deep within Philip's personal directives, a clause known cryptically as the Sunset Provision. When a sealed annex was discovered in his Geneva lockbox, a location chosen specifically because it falls outside UK legal jurisdiction, everything changed. This wasn't just about fortune anymore. It was about ending something, or someone. The document was encrypted, bound in legal protections that stretched across borders, languages, and jurisdictions. Only 2 people were authorized to access its contents: Philip's longtime solicitor, Edward Lassenby, and Princess Anne. When it was finally opened beneath the stone silence of a Geneva vault, with lawyers from 3 countries present, the truth surged like a tidal wave back toward Buckingham Palace. The annex, formerly titled Codicil 4B, contained instructions of staggering finality. In it, Philip declared that no assets, whether material, symbolic, or institutional, may pass to or through a consort lacking sovereign lineage. Listen to that again. Let every word land. In effect, it rendered Camilla and any descendant or dependent of hers entirely excluded from claim, not just to his personal fortune, but to any structure or legacy bearing his name. It was a full and deliberate severance, executed with the precision of a surgical strike. The language was chilling in its clarity. The Sunset Clause, as his legal team later confirmed, was inserted as a failsafe against what Philip described as the misdirection of institutional equity toward parties unbound by royal succession. He framed it not as a personal rebuke, though everyone knew it was, but as an act of constitutional preservation. But within palace walls, no one doubted the subtext. Camilla had been written out. Formally, legally, irrevocably. The reaction was instantaneous. Charles's legal advisory team was thrown into absolute panic. The codicil's legality, notarized in Switzerland, meant UK estate law had no jurisdiction to contest it. There would be no quiet amendments, no behind-the-scenes rewording, no legal loopholes. Worse still, the clause was airtight. Any attempt to circumvent it would trigger a reversion clause that would send the estate's entirety, estimated in the tens of millions, to an external, undisclosed trust. If Charles moved against it, the whole fortune would disappear from the Crown's reach altogether. One advisor allegedly remarked, "Philip planned this with the precision of a general. He left no door unlocked." But perhaps the most damning question became, who else knew about this? Eyes turned once again to Princess Anne. Speculation mounted that Anne had long been aware of the codicil's existence, that she'd been holding it in reserve like a nuclear option. If she had withheld its disclosure, it wasn't out of malice. It was out of strategy, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the palace to fracture just enough that the clause would land not as disruption, but as reckoning. Anne refused to confirm or deny her involvement, maintaining a silence that spoke volumes. For those watching closely, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a final letter from a royal patriarch. This was a time-locked detonation, carefully planted, patiently waiting, designed to explode at precisely the moment it would do maximum damage to those Philip believed threatened the monarchy's survival. And now the bomb had gone off. Catherine's masterstroke. In a move that shocked even her closest allies, Catherine made her countermove, not in anger, not with vengeance, but with surgical precision, a new foundation, a symbolic pledge, and one quietly devastating transfer of power that would protect Prince Philip's legacy in a way no one anticipated. She didn't hold a press conference. There were no grand proclamations or media spectacles. But early one morning, the Royal Communications Office released a quiet statement that would reshape everything. The creation of the Philip Stewardship Trust, a private, independent body designed to uphold the values Prince Philip had spent his life defending: service, duty, quiet resilience. Here's the genius. The trust would not be governed by Buckingham Palace. It would answer to the public and be legally autonomous. In essence, Catherine had just moved Philip's legacy beyond the monarchy's direct reach and closer to the people he had so often claimed were the only reason the monarchy mattered at all. Royal observers were stunned. Legal teams who'd agonized over the sunset clause now found themselves boxed out entirely. Catherine, in one carefully crafted stroke, had accepted the responsibility of Philip's wishes without appearing to claim the spoils. She refused to inherit the fortune directly. Instead, she appointed a circle of trustees, figures known for their independence, integrity, and most crucially, their loyalty to her vision. In doing so, she denied Camilla any access, not through confrontation, but through structure, not through emotion, but through architecture. It was brilliant, it was bloodless, and it was absolutely devastating. But the message didn't stop with bank accounts or titles. Catherine reallocated several of Prince Philip's most beloved patronages, the Duke's military affiliations, his environmental projects, even the famed Duke of Edinburgh awards, all redirected, not to traditional senior royals, but to the next generation: Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Lady Louise Windsor. It was a silent succession plan, bypassing debate and emotion in favor of legacy-building action. Catherine wasn't claiming Philip's memory. She was planting it in the future, where it could grow, where it could endure. The public response was seismic. Approval ratings for Catherine soared to historic highs, numbers not seen since the early days of Princess Diana. Editorials described her as the Crown's conscience. Social media erupted in what commentators dubbed the quiet coronation. Meanwhile, Camilla's image, already fragile in the aftermath of the letter, suffered a brutal dip. Analysts noted that for the first time in years, Camilla had become an emblem of division, while Catherine embodied continuity. And then came the moment that silenced any lingering doubt. In an unreleased segment of a BBC archival documentary, footage held back for years, Prince Philip appeared on screen, seated beside Queen Elizabeth, speaking candidly about the younger royals. When asked who he believed truly understood duty, he paused, smiled slightly, and said, "Catherine, she's the one. She knows when to speak and when to let the moment speak for her." The footage played on screens across the world. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Buckingham Palace, cornered by both legal precision and overwhelming public sentiment, issued a short statement. It formally acknowledged Catherine as the steward of the Duke's private charitable intentions. No ceremony needed, no fanfare required. The Queen Consort was silent. King Charles, according to aides, made no objection. Peace seemed to settle over the palace like snow after a storm. But even as quiet returned, one final whisper of Philip's intent emerged, from the most unexpected voice of all. The next generation. It was during a quiet public engagement in Wales, cameras rolling, press present, that young Prince George was asked a simple question by a reporter. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The 12-year-old prince stood next to his mother, surrounded by schoolchildren, smiling that careful royal smile they teach them young. He paused, looked briefly at Catherine, then answered, "I'll do what Great-Grandpa asked. I'll take care of it." The moment was captured, broadcast, and within hours had gone viral across every platform. The quote was cryptic, hauntingly mature, and instantly linked to the storm that had gripped the monarchy for months. Was it rehearsed? A coincidence? Or had the youngest heir already been drawn into the shadows of a legacy written before his birth? Royal press officers immediately scrambled to contain the fallout, framing it as a child's whimsical response, a sweet nod to family history. But inside palace corridors, whispers suggested something far more deliberate. Sources close to Catherine claimed she had begun, with great caution, introducing George to Philip's life, not through formal briefings or stern lectures, but through storytelling, guided lessons, quiet afternoons with a carefully selected private tutor. This tutor, it's said, was chosen specifically for his knowledge of royal lineage, political philosophy, and historical precedents. George wasn't being raised to simply be king. He was being raised to understand the difference between holding the crown and earning it. Then came the rumor that gripped royal watchers worldwide. The Philip Archive, the sealed collection of the Duke's private journals, letters, and personal correspondences, may not have been destroyed or absorbed by the crown as previously thought. It may have been set aside, protected, waiting, and destined ultimately for George. If true, it would mean that Philip's voice, his principles, his warnings were not just echoes of the past, but instruments of the future. A guidebook for a future king, written by the man who spent 70 years watching how monarchies survive and how they fall. As of today, an uneasy calm has settled over Buckingham Palace. Catherine continues her duties with the same quiet grace that earned Philip's respect. The Philip Stewardship Trust operates independently, funding causes the Duke held dear, untouchable by palace politics. Camilla appears at state functions, plays her role as Queen Consort. But those who watch closely say the warmth between her and Catherine never returned. The silence speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. King Charles, caught between the legacy of his father and the love of his wife, has chosen a path of public neutrality. But palace insiders wonder, at what cost to his own peace of mind? Prince Philip's sealed letter has done exactly what perhaps he always intended. It has drawn a line in the sand. It has forced the monarchy to confront questions it would rather avoid. It has placed the future of the crown not in the hands of politicians or protocols, but in the hands of one woman who never asked for this burden, but accepted it anyway. Because that's what duty means. That's what Philip understood. And that's what he saw in Catherine from the very beginning. So what do you think? Was Prince Philip a visionary protecting the crown's future? Or did he set in motion a conflict that could ultimately destroy the very institution he fought to preserve? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story shocked you as much as it shocked the palace insiders who lived through it, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because the battle for the British monarchy is far from over. More revelations are coming. More sealed documents may yet surface. And the inner four? They're still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next move. Don't miss what happens next. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.